It's great to see so many folks out there, and it's just great to see you. I'd like to take a sec and just acknowledge both our funding and some of our collaborators. So this project was funded by the Joint Fire Science Program, and some of our original PIs included John Kim, Nicole Valant, and Bridget Naylor from the Forest Service's Pacific Northwest Research Station, and Meg Crouchock from Oregon State University. Also in bold are some of our lead scientists who will be speaking today, and I will introduce them before their talks. So I'd like to take this time to acknowledge some of our other really important collaborators without which this work wouldn't be possible. At Oregon State University, we have Alex Dye, Rebecca Lemons, Temesgen Halmariam, Luke Ritter, Leslie Morris, Simone Gibson, and Robert Kennedy. At the Forest Service's Rocky Mountain Research Station, we have Karen Riley and Michelle Day. We'd also like to acknowledge Kevin Vogler and Joe Scott from Pyrologics, and Allison Dean from the Bureau of Land Management. Ventinata kind of got on my radar, and this was after several large wildfires in the Blue Mountain Ecoregion in 2014 and 2015. So there were actually several researchers at PNW who were contacted by some folks from the field who had been involved in these fires. And that was because they were noticing some really unusual fire behavior in these open areas scattered throughout the forest. Usually these open areas don't really burn because they don't carry a lot of fire. However, in these fires, folks were reporting that these areas actually carried fire rather quickly and unexpectedly. And Ventenata dubia, a relatively new invasive annual grass, was reportedly to blame. So folks from the field had a lot of questions and were really interested in having additional information about the species. So this photo is actually from the 2015 Corner Creek fire. All the yellow grass that you can see in the foreground and in the background in those open areas is Ventenata dubia. And this picture was taken about 5 years after the fire. These are what these areas typically look like. These open, rocky, low productivity areas or scablands interspersed throughout the forest. So they really don't have much fuel to burn. And the invasion of these areas by Ventenata was really curious, as these areas have resisted invasion from other annual grasses that have been in the area for quite a long time, like Medusa head and cheatgrass. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Ventinata, I mentioned cheatgrass. It's similar to cheatgrass. It's a winter annual grass. It's very shallow rooted. The species is in the oak tribe. Winter annual grasses germinate in the fall. They overwinter and then really grow with that pulse of early spring moisture. Like other invasive annual grasses in the Western US, Ventinata is native to Eurasia. It was introduced near Spokane, Washington, where that little yellow marker is on the map. And it's been documented in 8 Western states and parts of Canada. And it is spreading quite rapidly, as I mentioned, with about over 1 million hectares a year in spread documented. So in response to these somewhat alarming patterns of invasion and reports we were hearing, we worked with folks in the area to develop a series of studies to examine how Ventinata may be transforming the area and what the current and future ecological impacts might be in the ecoregion. So those of you unfamiliar with the Blue Mountain Ecoregion, it's a large area covering, it is in 3 states. Most of the area is in Oregon. It's about 71,000 square kilometers. So that's about the size of Ireland. Land ownership includes several national forests, BLM, state and private, and tribal lands. The region is characterized by continental, semi-arid, and dry climates. There's a variety of environmental conditions across the ecoregion that support a variety of habitats, from semi-arid grasslands up into subalpine forests and alpine areas. Our study focused on 4 interrelated objectives. We wanted to determine the current state of the invasion, how the invasion has changed through time, and what environmental and disturbance factors influence populations. We wanted to explore how future climate change may alter the habitat suitability and potential distribution of the species, although we're not talking about that particular aspect today. We wanted to examine and describe Ventenata invasion dynamics in dwarf shrublands, also known as scablands, and in non-forested areas. And our fourth objective, we wanted to estimate potential shifts in fuels and fire regimes and use wildfire simulations to examine how the invasion might change fire behavior, burn probabilities, fire size, and fire effects in the ecoregion now and into the future. So this slide just shows those four objectives, and they're all information from one objective fed into the other objective, which will be hopefully a little more apparent as we start launching into the talks. So there is a couple things I mentioned we're not going to be talking about today, that future distribution piece, which is we're in preparation, and that will be submitted soon to a journal, but that's not quite finished. And then we also have a paper on grazing and Ventinata and prescribed fire on the Zumwalt Prairie that was just published by Luke Ritter in 2022. And we won't be talking about that today. At the end of the talk, I will have a list of citations that are available on our website. So you can jot things down, but there's also another place that you can go for that. So right now, I'd like to just go ahead and move forward with our first talk. Claire Tortorelli will be talking about a new grass fire cycle and impacts to native plant communities. Claire is a PhD candidate at Oregon State University in the Forest Ecosystems and Society. Claire's been working with myself and Dr. Meg Crouchuk. So Claire, take it away.
Thanks, Becky. Stop your screen share.
Yeah.
All right, can you see that okay?
Yes, I can see it.
Great. Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Becky. And like Becky said, I'll be talking about Ventinata and its potential to create a new grass fire cycle for the inland Northwest. Oh no, wait, there it goes. Okay. So many of you are familiar with the invasion fire feedbacks. But as a quick overview, the cycle begins when invasive grasses increase fuel loads in an invaded ecosystem such as this one. Got a little slide delay. And that can lead to more severe and larger wildfires, especially in these historically pyro-resistant communities. Invasive grasses can create larger fires than would have been typical of the historical range of variability. And when these invasive grasses recover quickly after fire, they can initiate positive invasion fire feedbacks, which can lead to the loss of native species, especially for those that are not adapted to recover quickly after fire, like sagebrush. They don't resprout after fire. And this can lead to further losses in ecosystem function and structure. So these grass fire cycles or invasive grass influence on fire and fire frequency have been observed from across the American West. This is a paper put out by Emily Pisco and others that shows just the extent of these annual grasses, annual and perennial grasses throughout the American West and where they've been influencing fire regimes. As you can see, there are many species that influence fires in our western warm and cold deserts, like different annual bromes, cheatgrass, and red brome, as well as Medusa head. But there's kind of this gap here in our western forests, especially here where I've circled our Blue Mountains ecoregions in eastern Oregon, where these grass fire feedbacks have not been previously documented. But as you now know, that this is changing with a new annual grass invader called Ventenata. And like Becky showed, here's another photo of how Ventinata is invading some of these historically sparsely vegetated dwarf sagebrush or scabland communities where it could be having similar impacts to cheatgrass and other grasses across the American West. So just as a quick overview, kind of problems we're seeing, Becky showed some of this as well. Ventinata commonly invades these historically sparsely vegetated or rocky forest openings called scablands, where it has the potential to increase fuels, and that could promote fire in previously pyro-resistant communities, as we're seeing here. And this could have huge impacts for biodiversity, especially again for those species like the sagebrush pictured here that don't recover quickly after fire. And for fire management, I'm just going to show a quick video here of a friend, Will Downing, he's a smoke jumper. He's jumping into one of these scablands to access a nearby fire. So you can see the fire burning in the forest adjacent to the scabland, but it's stopping at that scabland boundary. It's not spreading into the scabland. And that's owing to its really low fuel loads. There's just not enough fuel in the scabland to really carry that fire across, which allows the smoke jumpers to access the fire here relatively safely. But you can imagine if all these bare ground patches, these interspaces between these sparsely vegetated or these sparse shrubs and grasses were filled with Ventinata or some kind of annual grass or fine fuel, that fire might spread through the scabland and make that access more difficult. And that could have severe implications for fire management across this larger landscape. So to really understand the potential impacts of the Ventinata invasion and to help us develop more species-specific management plans, it's important to understand if and how Ventinata may contribute to a new grass fire cycle. So this is what I'll be discussing for the remainder of this presentation. And this is kind of what we're looking for to see if Ventinata does indeed contribute to a grass fire cycle. We expect that invasion will increase fine fuels, which will have a positive effect on fire, which in turn fire will positively impact Ventinata. It will recover quickly after fire, and all of this will have a negative impact on the native plant community, especially in these areas that didn't evolve with frequent fire. The first question I'm going to tackle today is, how does invasion influence fuels and fire behavior? And we'll go into this kind of throughout this presentation with multiple speakers, but just as a very brief, a very small snippet of this, we measured fine fuel loads in uninvaded and invaded scablands. And as you can really just see from the photo, but with some measurements involved, these uninvaded scablands have very low fuels, on average less than 0.01 tons per acre. And we're seeing about a 50-fold increase in that fine fuel load on these invaded patches when we have about 50 to 80% cover of Ventinata. So that's a huge increase in fine fuel loads. And when we feed that into a fire model called Behave Plus, we see that simulated rate of spread and flame length were much higher, like 2 to 4 times higher in the invaded than the uninvaded scablands. And this was work done by an undergraduate, Simone Gibson, as part of her undergraduate thesis project with Oregon State University. And just the idea is here is that you're really seeing higher rates of spread and higher flame lengths in those invaded scablands compared to uninvaded scablands. So I think we could say, at least for simulated fire, that yes, indeed, Ventinata may influence simulated fire behavior, especially in these scabland patches where we're seeing higher rates of spread, higher simulated flame lengths because of that increase in fine fuels. So the next question, that's all well and good, but we need to know whether fire influences Ventinata. If fire has a negative impact on Ventinata, for example, we might not see this fire cycle completed, but if it has a positive impact, then we could just see further increases in fuels, further increases in fire. So to measure how Ventinata responded to fire, as well as plant community and other annual grasses, we teamed up with Ali Dean, who's the BLM Fire Effects Monitoring Coordinator out of Prineville. And she had the great foresight to install some monitoring plots before a prescribed burn in the Ochoco National Forest, this Upper Beaver prescribed burn shown here. And so she installed plots outside of the burn unit and within the burn unit in 2016 prior to the burn. And then we sampled invasive species as well as vegetation, so all species present along transects, again, before the fire in 2016 and 3 years after the fire in 2018, 2019, and 2020. So 1 year after the fire, 2 years, and 3 years post-burn. And we measured to see how grasses were changing compared to native vegetation and just how they were changing with and without fire. And so I'll only be showing some of the results from the study today, specifically focused on how those annual grasses are recovering post-fire. So I'm going to show you a plot that looks like this. This is just our kind of predicted response to fire, where we have mean cover of annual grass on the y-axis and year on the x-axis, with our burn year being here in 2017, our first sampling occurring in 2016, and then again in 2018, 2019, 2020. And what I would expect if Ventinata were to respond as kind of we think of the cheatgrass responding to fire, that maybe they're starting off pretty similar before the fire, but we're going to see increases in annual grass cover after fire, maybe starting in 2018, maybe a little later. But at the end, I expect these burn plots to have higher cover of annual grass than the unburned plots. And so first, we just looked at how the cover of Ventinata compared before the fire. What we're seeing is that we saw high severity burning, so more burning. This is just for plots within that burn perimeter. We saw more burning than in plots with higher Ventinata cover than with lower Ventinata cover. And that might be expected. So again, we've got more fine fuels that might influence the burning. So we're seeing higher severity fire where we have more cover. And if we play that out over time, we see that Ventinata is increasing over time, but it doesn't really matter whether it's burning or not. Seeing kind of similar levels of increasing in the burn plots compared to the unburned plots. And if anything, burning might even be having a slightly negative impact on that rate of expansion compared to the unburned plots shown in the green. So we're seeing kind of a slower level of increase in the high severity plots in red compared to those unburned plots in green or blue. And this is so then we decided to compare how this Ventinata responds to fire compared to cheatgrass. And we found that there's slightly different patterns after fire, whereas Ventinata was increasing really quickly post-fire, even to above pre-fire levels in the burned and unburned plots. We saw kind of a slower, maybe even a decrease in cheatgrass cover following fire in the high severity plots compared to the unburned plots. We're not seeing huge increases here over a couple years post-fire until about year 3 in 2020, where we're seeing a large increase in cheatgrass cover with that burning. And so this is just showing us that these species respond differently to fire, whereas Ventinata seems to be pretty uninfluenced by fire. If anything, maybe even slightly fall prescribed burns. This is a prescribed burn that occurred in the fall post seed drop. Compared to cheatgrass, which has maybe a slightly negative impact. Fire has slightly negative impact on cheatgrass the first year, and then by the third year, we're seeing higher cover of cheatgrass in those severely burned plots compared to the unburned plots. So this one's kind of a question mark for how does fire influence Ventinata? We're seeing maybe it's not has a huge positive effect on Ventinata, but we know from this study and other studies that Ventinata can recover very quickly after fire. You saw just 1 year after fire, we're exceeding those pre-fire levels. So indeed, there would be the potential to complete this cycle, even if this isn't a very strong positive influence on Ventinata invasion. So next, for my last topic here, I want to cover the ecological impacts of fire and invasion. So how are fire and invasion combined influencing plant communities? And primarily what I'll be focusing on here is what is the relationship between Ventinata and species richness. And I have 3 hypotheses or predictions here about how Ventinata and species richness might interact. The first being that Ventinata may reduce diversity. It may outcompete native species and have a negative relationship with species richness just by being a better competitor. The second are that it could have a negative relationship with species richness, but simply because it's invading areas with lower diversity. So that's actually being outcompeted by native species, but in that way, we still see that negative relationship because it's invading these areas that have a lower richness of native species to begin with. And the third is that maybe there's not a strong relationship, no effect on native species at all, and rather it's just filling in the gaps around native species, kind of occupying this previously unoccupied niche, or using resources that are not being used by the existing species. And the second thing we want to know is, do these relationships change after fire? So what's the relationship without and with fire to these native species? And to ask this question, we installed sampling vegetation monitoring plots in many different plant community types, spanning from those scablands to juniper to open ponderosa, even closed canopy ponderosa douglas fir forests, and mountain big sagebrush across the Blue Mountain ecoregion across 7 wildfires, where we sampled within the burn perimeter, so in burned plots, and just outside the burn perimeters and unburned areas. And what we wanted to know again was how Ventinata cover responded to species richness. So here we have increasing species richness on the y-axis and increasing Ventinata cover on the x-axis. And so in those unburned plots, we really did not see a strong relationship here between species richness and Ventinata cover. Basically, no effect, not a strong relationship in unburned areas. This was different, however, when we looked at the burn sites, where we saw more of a negative relationship between species richness and Ventinata cover. Here we saw decreasing, as Ventinata cover increased, we saw a decreasing species richness. And these two things together kind of tell us, well, the first one, this where we're seeing not a strong relationship in the unburned sites, indicates to me that Ventinata is maybe just filling in those gaps in the unburned sites. Whereas in the burn sites, we could either have, A, Ventinata is outcompeting those native species, or B, it's invading burned areas with lower cover of native species to begin with. But because this is occurring in the burn sites, my hunch is that we're probably seeing some outcompeting. Ventinata outcompeting some other species. It recovers very quickly after fire, like we saw. And so it may be coming back quickly after fire and really outcompeting those existing species for those limited post-fire resources. So we wanted to know too, which species are have that negative relationship. So we know that species richness is decreasing, but which species are we losing in those burned and invaded sites? And so we looked at functional group cover for every species we could find out in these different plots. And what we found were that this kind of group on the right, which consists of annual forbs, native annual forbs, and other invasive annual grasses, including medusa head and cheatgrass, and our shrub component, were the ones that were decreasing the most with increasing Ventinata and in those burn sites. And this makes a lot of sense when we think about it, because these are the species that they're recovering primarily from seed after fire, like Ventinata, so they're not resprouting like maybe some of our perennial species typically. And since Ventinata is a fall germinating species and some of our native annual forbs are spring germinating, it could be that Ventinata is just feeding these spring germinating species to those resources and is preventing them from coming back at as high of numbers as before the fire. And for the other invasive annual grasses, we can see a similar thing. Perhaps Ventinata is just a stronger competitor in these areas for those post-fire resources. And for the shrubs, this makes a lot of sense too, because we're losing shrubs with burning. They're not resprouting after fire, and they take a really long time to recover. We might not see shrub recovery 5 years after fire in some of these drier sites. So again, in our unburned sites, we're seeing probably Ventinata is really filling in the gaps between native plants. So far, the diversity is relatively unchanged, although I want to emphasize that this is short term. Ventinata hasn't invaded these areas for very long, so it could be that these patterns will start to shift as Ventinata has been around longer or maybe increases in abundance. And in the burn communities, you might see a different trend that Ventinata could be outcompeting native species and reducing that diversity and function in burn sites. So putting this all together, saying that indeed we have the potential to instate a grass fire cycle in the inland Northwest, although we haven't recorded many repeat fires in these burned areas just because Ventinata hasn't been around that long. That potential definitely exists. And that could have really negative impacts for the plant communities, especially in these scabland sites. So finally, just a couple implications of this work. Again, we're seeing invading previously uninvaded areas that could increase the overall invasion footprint. So we're adding kind of we're filling in that gap in that original figure I showed you of where grasses are influencing fire and fire frequency across the United States. It alters fuel and fire behavior in these previously fire-resistant communities. And invades regardless of invasion. Invades regardless of, fire, and recovers quickly after burning. So we're seeing it's invading both burned and unburned sites, but it does recover quickly after burning. That fall burning could reduce invasion compared to unburned areas, but we need to be really careful about the implications of burning and invasion on native plant species, and realized that we only have data 3 years after fire. We don't know how fall burning may influence invasion farther out than that. And we have no direct effect of diversity in unburned communities in the short term again. And that's all I have for you. I'd be happy to take your questions if we have a little bit of time.
Okay, we do have a few questions that were put into the Q&A box. However, I think that they may get answered as Tai presents next. He's presenting on the present and past ecoregional invasion patterns and wildfire relationships. And since we get started just a few minutes late, I'm thinking we can just go right into the next session, and we'll save questions for the end of his and make up a little time.
That's great. Thanks, Adam.
Yeah.
Okay, our next speaker is going to be Tai Matapski. Tai will be talking about the present and past ecoregional invasion patterns and wildfire relationships. Tai is presently a postdoc with the Pacific Northwest Research Station through the ORISE Fellowship Program. He completed his PhD just this past spring. He was working with myself as well as Temesgen Halmarian. And go ahead and take it away, Tai.
Thank you, Becky. Appreciate the introduction there. As Becky mentioned, I'm an ORISE postdoc working with her at the Pacific Northwest Research Station. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my work from the last few years that I did also in collaboration with Temesgen Halmarian. As opposed to looking kind of close down with some of Claire's work, like on the ground, seeing how things are looking, we're going to take a step back here and look at some of the past, present invasion patterns at the ecoregional level and how these things have changed through time. So as we heard from Claire and Becky, the invasion of Ventinata, like other annual grasses, can lead to, or has the potential to lead to the development of a grass fire cycle. So as such, we need detailed spatial information about the past and present distribution of Ventinata in order to understand where impacts might occur. And we can use this information to learn about invasion trends that may have occurred before some of these field-based monitoring efforts began. And while Ventinata at this point is not as advanced in its invasion in the Western US as other well-known species, it's important for us to develop an understanding of the invasion so that we can address problems before further impacts occur and control costs increase. So the distribution of other invasive annual grasses has been mapped at regional scales by leveraging distinct temporal growth patterns exhibited by these species. Cheatgrass in particular has been the focus of many of these studies due to its abundance and impact in the Great Basin, especially. However, as new species have been introduced and become abundant, differentiation of these species based on their growth patterns alone has come into question. So fortunately, Ventinata has some characteristics that make it unique compared to other annual grass species. First, it does have unique growth patterns that differ from other invasives in the region. And this is at least based on field observations. And secondly, multiple recent studies have pointed out that Ventinata's niche or habitat requirements differ from other annual grass species. So we capitalized on these differences to map the distribution of Ventinata. So how are we using the distribution of Ventinata to understand the invasion? Changes in the distribution of a species over time can provide useful information about the invasion process itself. This information can help to key into sources of propagules from persistent populations that might lead to future invasions, or give us an indication of the plant communities that are most vulnerable to invasion. So in order to look at changes in the distribution of Ventinata, we modeled its distribution at 2 time points, 2006 and 2017. And I'll get into why we chose those 2 particular years a little later on. So we aim to address 2 fire cycle related questions with this research. First, we wanted to quantify how and where Ventenata's distribution changed over the last decade. Expansion of Ventenata past can provide some indication of where along, for example, an elevational gradient Ventenata has been invading, or what plant communities have experienced the greatest invasion or expansion of Ventenata populations. And this in turn can help us to understand the spatial context to where fine fuels may be impacted by the invasion of Ventenata. Second, we wanted to examine where wildfires that occurred during the last decade impacted the spatial distribution of Ventenata. Fire occurrence or severity may influence the way that Ventenata spreads across a landscape, and fire-related spread of Ventenata can have impacts to future fuel distribution in these landscapes, and so we need to know if and how Ventenata spreads in post-fire environments. So like some of like Claire's project, the focus of the ecoregion we're focusing on in this study is also the Blue Mountains Ecoregion. And just to reiterate, this is located in the interior Pacific Northwest, and it's kind of sandwiched between the Cascades and the Rockies. In order for us to develop a model for Ventenata, first we compiled a data set of 944 field observations of Ventenata from around 2017. It'll be important to remember moving forward that we classified presence in this data set as any observation with greater than 20% cover and absence as anything below 20% cover. So with our field observations of Ventenata, we modeled its present distribution using satellite-derived land surface phenology and environmental predictors. Land surface phenology is a term used to describe the temporal patterns of vegetation development as observed by satellite imagery. So to the right is an example of how satellite observations, shown in orange here, can be described to show the start or end of a growth cycle or other properties of an annual growth cycle. We fit 3 models and evaluated them against each other and predictions of cheatgrass in order to determine which model was best represented, or which model best represented the present distribution of Ventenata. Through this process, we determined that a hybrid approach that used both land surface phenology and biophysical conditions best represented the present distribution of Ventenata. With our 2017 model of Ventenata, we then selected another year that we could look at the change in Ventenata's, used to look at the change in Ventenata's distribution. So annual grass growth is strongly influenced by year-to-year fluctuations in climate. So to predict the historic distribution of Ventenata, we look for a year in the past with similar climatic conditions. We made this selection based on climatic similarity between years using a drought severity index and RAWS weather station data. We found that 2006 and 2017 had the most similar conditions that would help us to improve model transferability of a model trained in 2017 to predict in 2006. In this figure, we can see 2006 and 2017 indicated by gray shading. In the top 2 panels of the figure, we see a time series of drought severity for the Blue Mountains ecoregion, and the bottom shows the similarity of RAWS weather station data for years preceding 2017 to 2017. Both 2017 and 2006 started in non-drought conditions, and then later in the year transitioned to drought conditions. We used land surface phenology from 2006 to develop a second map of Ventenata's distribution. So now we have an idea of where Ventenata was within the Blue Mountains ecoregion at 2 time points, 2006 and 2017. We used our 2 maps of Ventenata's distribution to examine how the invasion occurred over about a decade. And we looked at how Ventinata patch characteristics changed, how invasion occurred on an elevational gradient, and which vegetation habitat types were associated with Ventinata over time. We also used information about the invasion to examine how changes in Ventinata's distribution related to large wildfires. To do this, we looked at all wildfires that occurred between 2006 and 2017 in the MTBS database, which is about a total of 119. We wanted to take the spatial arrangement and dominant cover of burned areas into account because fuels abundance and arrangement play an important role in wildfire. So we grouped fires based on the proportion of forest and non-forest vegetation types. And you can kind of see that gradient there on the right, the spatial arrangement going from mostly non-forest to mostly forest. And then we also grouped based on the most abundant vegetation type. And those are listed below there and include shrubland, woodland, dry forests, mixed conifer forests, and subalpine forests. Within these fires, we quantified the average probability of Ventinata and compared this to the average probability of Ventinata in areas that did not experience large wildfires within the region. And these non-burned areas, we selected, sampled from the region with replacement, and we selected areas that were the size of the median fire of those 119 fires throughout the region in areas that didn't experience a large fire. We also looked at how burn severity might have influenced the Ventinata invasion within these fires. And we did this by quantifying burn severity for each fire, and then we evaluated the difference in burn severity by the change in the presence of Ventinata. So first, I'll give a brief overview of some of the changes that occurred in the distribution of Ventinata before getting into how these related to the fires that occurred between 2006 and 2017. Based on our models, the Ventinata invasion increased from about 5% of the region in 2006 to 8% by 2017. This is an increase of about 44% in invaded area over a little bit more than a decade. The mean patch size increased by almost 50%, and the total number of patches decreased, which indicates to me that Ventinata was spreading more radially than discontinuously at this ecoregional scale. The figure here to the right shows patches of expansion, persistence, and contraction. While this view of the invasion is quite broad, much of the expansion was occurring from persistent patches in open areas, and many of the populations of Ventinata were found along the edges of more heavily forested parts of the region. While the amount of contraction that occurred across the region was small in comparison to expansion and persistence, some did occur, and these areas were common along the border of forest stands where canopy cover increased between 2006 and 2017. The region-wide trend of radial expansion from existing populations was not echoed in all areas. In forest areas where habitat was more fragmented, Ventinata spread in more of a discontinuous or jumping manner. Patches of Ventinata in these areas tended to be more linear and were not directly connected to persistent populations. In this figure on the right, we can see the patchy spatial configuration of Starkey experimental forest. Invasion in this area led to both an increase in the mean patch size and the total number of patches. And this is represented as kind of an infilling of many of the forest openings with Ventinata from 2006 to 2017. In this particular example, we can see a large area of persistent populations on the eastern side of Starkey, and the expansion occurred north and west of this location. We can also see in blue in the zoomed in area labeled A that there was some contraction occurring, and like I mentioned in the previous slide, most of this was kind of on the boundary of some of the forested areas. In addition to spatial changes in Ventenata's distribution, we saw that Ventenata was increasing across the elevational gradient. This figure shows where expansion, persistence, and contraction were occurring along the elevational gradient of the Blue Mountains. In panel A of this figure is the entire elevational profile of the Blue Mountains outlined in black with the Ventenata invasion in color. Panel B of this figure zooms into the invaded range, while panel C shows the breakdown of the invaded area in terms of the proportion that was expansion, persistence, or contraction. Over this 11-year period, expansion occurred disproportionately at higher elevations, especially over 1,300 meters. Persistent populations dominated the mid to lower elevations, and there was a higher proportion of contraction at the margins of the invaded range. However, the total area of contraction was relatively small in comparison to expansion and persistence. The increased invasion at higher elevation was echoed in Ventenata's association with habitat in this region, as defined by potential natural vegetation. While the greatest area of persistent populations was found in upland shrub and juniper woodland vegetation types, expansion was greatest in dry ponderosa pine and xeric pine. Other habitats that experienced a substantial increase in invasion included scabline grass, montane shrub, and moist meadow, although these types of habitat cover a much smaller portion of the region's total area. Our results from looking at the region-wide changes in invasion suggested that Ventenata has been predominantly spreading from existing patches, but has been moving upward in elevation into more forested areas and into the forest, non-forest ecotones of those areas. Now we'll look at whether large fires play a role in the observed patterns of invasion in the higher elevation dry forests. Our comparison between areas that experienced wildfire and those that did not showed that in general, there was an increase in the probability of Ventenata regardless of wildfire occurrence. However, there were some vegetation communities for which wildfire occurrence was associated with an increase in the mean percent change of Ventenata probability. These include areas with a high proportion of forest and non-forest mixtures that were dominated by woodlands, the mixed the mixed woodland class, as well as areas that were dominated by forests, and mostly forested and dominated by forests, and those would be the dry forest and mixed conifer classes here. The only exception kind of to these general patterns was the subalpine forests, and during this time period, we only had 2 fires that fell into that class, but this was the only community in which the probability of Ventenata actually decreased in the absence of wildfire. So within each wildfire, we looked at burn severity between classes of percent change in the probability of Ventenata, with classes that range from decreasing probability to increasing probability. For each of the vegetation groups, based on spatial arrangement and dominant cover type, we evaluated the pairwise differences in burn severity between Ventenata classes. We then averaged these differences across the wildfires to examine the relationship between burn severity and the post-fire change in the probability of Ventenata. What this analysis showed was that despite some differences between vegetation groups, the probability of Ventenata generally increased with increasing burn severity. The greatest difference in burn severity between successive Ventenata classes was found in the mixed dry forest class, the dry forest class, and the mixed conifer class. Both pure and mixed spatial arrangements in the shrubland and woodland groups followed a somewhat similar pattern, although the average differences in burn severity were a much lower magnitude. And then again, for the subalpine group, there was no discernible pattern, but as I previously mentioned, we only had 2 large fires in this data set. So that's likely impacting our ability to detect the relationship in these settings. So I'd like to give an example of what the relationship between severity and Ventinata class might look like spatially. To do this, we'll have a look at the Canyon Creek complex. This wildfire occurred in 2015 in an area dominated by dry forest that also contained a mixture of many other vegetation types. And we can kind of see a general overview of the area and get an idea of the spatial arrangement of vegetation within this area in panel A here, looking at some NAPE imagery. We can see the burn severity in panel B, where darker colors here represent lower severity and lighter colors represent higher severity. Panel C, like some of the previous figures I presented, show expansion, persistence, and contraction of Ventinata. And then finally, panel D shows the Ventinata classes with cool colors representing areas of decreased probability of Ventinata and warm colors showing increased probability of Ventinata. The information from panels B and D were represented in the previous slide in the kind of region-wide analysis of all the fires we had. In these panels, you can see that many of the areas with high severity also had a large increase in the probability of Ventinata. However, not all high severity areas had a large increase in the probability. So in this case, we found that expansion was primarily found near persistent patches. And you can see this kind of in panel C. And in general, expansion occurred more radially than discontinuously, which was indicated by an increase in the patch size and a decrease in the total number of patches. This radial kind of expansion from persistent patches was more consistent with the regional pattern, even though the pre-fire landscape of the Canyon Creek complex was more similar to the kind of mosaic of forest and non-forest patches that we saw in the Starkey experimental forest. So just to wrap up, I'd like to summarize a few key points. First, well, Ventinata has the potential to cause impacts along the elevational gradient and across different vegetation types. We found that more of the robust populations of Ventinata were occurring at higher elevations and within dry ponderosa pine and xeric pine vegetation types. These vegetation types are commonly present in the transition zone between more heavily forested areas and more shrub-dominated areas. And an addition of fine fuels in this setting could have an impact on fire transmission between these areas, and it might be an important consideration for moving forward. Secondly, while the factors that influence the spread of Ventinata are many, we found that fire occurrence and severity may be impacting the invasion of Ventinata at large spatial scales. We saw that Ventinata probability was higher in burned areas than non-burned areas. In mixed landscapes dominated by woodlands, the mixed woodland class, and forested landscapes dominated by dry forest or mixed conifer forest. We also found that increasing burn severity was associated with increasing probability of Ventinata, although this relationship differed by the spatial arrangement of the landscape and the dominant cover of the landscape. We found that the strength of the relationship between severity and Ventinata was greatest in the mixed dry forest, and mixed conifer groups. So I may have gone through that a little faster, but I guess I'll end it there. And I guess we can turn it over to the next presenters, or we can maybe answer a question or two. And if you have any specific questions that you'd like to address to me, you can contact me at the email address in the lower right-hand corner of this slide. I'd be happy to discuss anything. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Tai. A couple questions here. Many of you have been asking them and they've been getting answered in the Q&A box. But there is a couple around the 20% presence threshold.
Yeah.
And to why that was picked. And that seems like a fairly high threshold. So, why was it not a little bit lower?
Yeah, that is a good question. So the goal of our project here was to map the present distribution of Ventinata. And we're working with the highest resolution land surface phenology we could, which was 30-meter resolution. But even at that, to pick up distinct patterns in vegetation development requires, a relatively abundant population of whatever it is you're trying to detect. And so that's why we ended up going with a pretty robust cover threshold like that in order to differentiate, presence and absence in this model.
Okay, thank you. And next question is from Carl Dupult, and he asks, is climate change impacting the spread of Ventenata dubia?
That is a great question. I didn't directly address that specific question in any of this research, but it's certainly something that we're interested in looking into, and it's something we're working on looking at by examining where the suitability for Ventinata might change in the future, and how that could potentially, in fact, impact the future distribution of Ventinata. But in terms of present day climate conditions and how changes that have occurred at this point in any respect impact Ventinata, I can't really speak to that directly.
Okay. The next question is from Stephen Gibson, and he asks, does using drought index for similarity of climate in years really account for differences in timing of precipitation relative to temperature days?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah. Does using drought index for similarity of climate in years really account for differences in the timing of precipitation relative to temperature days?
Temperature days. So we looked at both drought severity index and a time series of weather data at 5 RAWS station across the region, and so we were looking for generally similar trends in weather patterns between years. I would imagine that obviously there's a lot of variability with, the timing of specific precipitation events that, we couldn't really account for, but that is a good question.
Okay. Next question is from John Punches, and he asks, can the increase in Ventinata presences following fire on forested sites be attributed to reduction in forest canopy or shrub shade, providing a seedbed suitable for its establishment, or Ventinata outcompeting native vegetation following fire?
So we didn't directly address the impact of canopy cover, of forest canopy cover, or the reduction of that post-fire and how that might impact the spread of the species, but based on the differences between those two model predictions and certain fires, it definitely seems like that would have a large impact. And we don't see Ventinata growing under high canopy cover. So, it could be a combination of reduction in canopy cover, increasing, light at the soil surface, or, that, and in addition to that, potentially, some, short-term kind of impacts to the herbaceous or shrub community that was also present there. So it could be a combination of factors, but it certainly seems like canopy reduction is a big factor in these places where Ventinata spread post-fire.
Okay. And what about the outcompeting the native vegetation post-fire? Does that seem like a fairly large factor in the increase after fire as well?
I can't, I didn't look at kind of that fine detail. I think Claire can talk more specifically about her studies looking at competition. And I think that maybe that question could be better answered by Claire if she wants to chime in, or we could talk about that later in terms of competition and that.
Okay, that sounds good. Maybe we can have a deeper discussion of that in the panel session at the end. Just a couple more questions here. Any data showing responses and timelines with revegetation techniques in areas of Ventinata?
I haven't personally seen that information, and I didn't collect information on that topic in particular. So maybe one of the other presenters today has some information about that, and that could be something we could talk about again later.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. We can leave the open questions still in the Q&A as well, and we can circle back to them if folks feel like they haven't been answered adequately or they have follow-up questions as well. So just one more question for you before I'll turn it back over to Becky to introduce the next person. And it's from Lisa Jones, asks, why do you think Ventenata invasion is more likely in those 3 forest types compared to the other veg types?
Why is it more likely in dry ponderous? I guess, can you, are you referring to where expansion was occurring within this region? Can I ask that as a follow-up, I guess? Because I guess we could get into that more too, but it looks like, so there was expansion that occurred.
Yes, by the way, she says yes, that's the question.
Yeah, so there was expansion that occurred in these upland shrublands. There was expansion that occurred in the woodland types as well. And maybe it's kind of hard to see, but if you can see my cursor, like this area, for example, and a lot of these areas down here are classified as like upland shrub or those woodland types. There was expansion there. It just, when you looked at the total expansion across the elevational gradient, there was kind of a disproportionate expansion in those specific habitat types or forest types, I guess. Forest types, probably not the right word, but yeah, so there was expansion in other areas as well, but the upland shrub classification for this region covers the largest area, I think, shortly followed by the woodland class. And so while there's substantial populations in those areas, the expansion relative to some of the other cover types was, less aggressive, or a lower rate, I guess.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Tai, for answering those questions. And again, if you had some that came in and we didn't get to them now, we will try to get to as many as we can, either in the box with typed answers or in the panel at the end, we'll open up for discussions. So Becky, would you like to introduce the next session?
Sure, yes, happy to do that. So our next talk is actually going to be covered by 2 folks, Claire Tortorelli and John Kim, and they are going to be talking about simulated present and future invasion-driven landscape fire effects. I've already introduced Claire, and so Claire will be speaking first, and then we'll just kind of roll into John's talk. So I'll go ahead and introduce John now. John Kim is a research biologist with the Forest Service, the Pacific Northwest Research Station here in Corvallis, Oregon. So why don't you go ahead and start, Claire?
Thanks, Becky. Can you see that okay?
I can.
Great. All right, so like Becky said, and Tai, we're going to move on now to talk about how the invasion influences landscape scale fire behavior. And so because the Blue Mountain Ecoregion, which is where the focus of this landscape scale fire portion of the study takes place, is such a large landscape, and Ventinata is a relatively recent invader, we chose to use a simulation approach to model how Ventinata influences burning over thousands of simulated fire years. And to do this, we used the large fire simulator, also called FSIM, which uses topography, weather, and fuels data, along with historical fire ignitions, fire size, and a fire suppression model to generate thousands of fire seasons to capture a long enough period to generate burn probabilities for the given landscape. So here I'm kind of showing just the inputs to the FSIM model and those fire outputs. And so along with that gridded raster file of annual burn probability, we also, FSIM also outputs flame length exceedance probability. And here we're talking about the conditional flame length probability, which is, if an area was to burn, what's the probability that that area would burn? And for the purpose of our study, we chose a flame length of 1.2 meters or 4 feet. So it's what's the probability of this area burning at greater than 1.2 meters if it were to burn. FSIM also outputs fire perimeters for every simulated fire for that 10,000 year run and ignition points for each of those simulated fires. And so we chose this conditional flame length probability, or CFLP, of greater than 1.2 meters, as it's a rough estimate of a measure of fire intensity that reflects the tipping point at which fire suppression is no longer likely to be contained by hand line alone. So it's kind of that shift in fire suppression from using hand lines to moving to larger machinery. So we thought this was a relevant tipping point to use as a metric in this study. So very briefly, to examine how invasion influenced simulated burn probability and fire behavior, we created 2 fuel landscapes that represent the ecoregion with and without invasion and fed these into FSIM. And so the uninvaded fuelscape, how we view the landscape with every pixel being represented by a fuel model that represents the vegetation, how that vegetation would burn at a given area when uninvaded. And then we used Tai's Ventenata invasion map that we just heard about, and we increased fuels in areas with relatively low historic fuel loads, where we perceive Ventinata to increase fire behavior and fuel loads, to shift that fuel model into kind of a higher, a different fuel model. So with more fuels burning at greater flame lengths and greater fire spread rates. And we used this new fuelscape as our invaded fuelscape. And all in all, so Tai's Ventinata invasion map covered much more than 2.5% of the landscape, but where it overlapped kind of our low productivity fuel types, or mostly those scab lands where I showed in my previous talk had very, very low fuel loads to begin with, where those two things overlapped, the invasion and those historically low fuel loads areas, was about 2.5% of the landscape. So of the whole ecoregion, we only ended up changing fuels in this 2.5% landscape to reflect invasion. So using those 2 fuelscapes, we calibrated FSIM to the invaded fuelscape, and then we ran FSIM on an invaded simulation and the uninvaded simulation using those 2 different fuelscapes. And doing this, we held all other input variables constant, including emissions and weather, so that the only thing that was changing here were the fuel. So really able to compare the differences in burn perimeters as well as all those outputs. So that conditional flame length probability and the annual burn probability, with only one factor changing, that being the fuels. And here are some of the outputs. So the first thing we looked at were the inputs to burn probability and flame lengths, and this is across the entire ecoregion. So averaging across that whole ecoregion. And here I'm showing the probability density function, which is essentially a smooth histogram for a couple of the different vegetation types throughout the ecoregion. And here we have the black line representing the uninvaded simulation, the red or orange line representing the invaded simulation, the parallel lines representing the medians, and the triangles showing the means for each of those simulations. And it's kind of difficult to see here because the differences are so small, And that's really to be expected because, again, we only change 2.5% of the fuels across the entire ecoregion. So when we average out the differences in burn probability or conditional flame length, we expect those differences to be relatively small. We can see that the greatest change, the greatest shift in burn probability and conditional flame length occurred in the dwarf shrubland vegetation type. That's also to be expected, as many of these areas were areas where we increased fuels because they had such low fuels to begin with. So really the takeaway here is that we're seeing the greatest impact of invasion on annual burn probability and conditional flame length probability of burning greater than 1.2 meters in the dwarf shrublands out of all the different vegetation types. And this is substantial even when we average across the entire ecoregion. So the next thing we want to ask is, how does invasion influence fire spread? So despite many of those vegetation types showing minimal shifts in fire behavior at the ecoregion scale, those uninvaded areas may be more heavily impacted by invasion when they exist in proximity to invaded patches. So for example, when evaluating the fire perimeters in the uninvaded landscape, we may see little fire spread between uninvaded and invaded vegetation types or across those ecotones. Like here, we have a fire that starts in the forest, but it's not spreading through the invaded patch like we saw in the smoke jumper video. But when this patch becomes invaded, we may see increased fire spread either both into that scabland patch and through the scabland patch into the surrounding forest. So we asked, how does invasion influence fire spread? And to answer this, we measured the area burned from fires ignited at each vegetation type. So here we have a matrix where on the y-axis, you can see the vegetation types that the fires were ignited in. So for example, this would be, the ignition occurred in the open tree canopy vegetation type. That's what we're seeing on the y-axis. On the x-axis is the vegetation type that the fire spread to. And then we filled in this matrix with the percent difference, or the percent increase in fire spread between those vegetation types that the fires were ignited in and where the fire spread to. So here we see the darkest, this 20% increase between areas, vegetation types, between the dwarf shrublands. So fires ignited in dwarf shrublands burn 28% more dwarf shrubland in the invaded scenario than in the uninvaded scenario. And essentially, this means we have more self-burning. We have more ignitions in the dwarf shrubland that are burning more area in the dwarf shrubland. Again, that's kind of to be expected, since these are the areas where we increase the fuels the most. In some, not all of the dwarf shrublands across the ecoregion, but the ones we sought to be invaded. But what's important here is we also see a lot of fire transmission between dwarf shrublands, so fires ignited in dwarf shrublands, and the closed and open tree canopy forest. So here we see a 15% increase in area burned in closed tree canopy forest and open forests from fires ignited in dwarf shrublands. So indicating that we're getting fire spread from dwarf shrublands into the surrounding forest. And vice versa, we also saw a 17% increase from fires ignited in open canopy forests that spread into dwarf shrublands. So they burned 17% more dwarf shrublands, and a 20% increase from fires ignited in closed canopy forests that burned 20% more dwarf shrubland area across the entire ecoregion. So that's pretty substantial. Those are pretty substantial increases in area burned because of that increased fire spread. So that's still about at the ecoregion scale. We're still averaging across the entire ecoregion, thinking more about fire spread. Now we want to know specifically about the effects on forest. So here I'm looking at thinking about how fire is changing for this focal forested cell, which is this forest cell at the center of this matrix. So we have a 116 hectare neighborhood surrounding the forest cell. And you can imagine that this neighborhood could be composed of all sorts of different vegetation types, some of them being invaded, some of them not. And here we want to know, how is burn probability and conditional flame length probability for the forest changing as the proportion of the surrounding landscape becomes more invaded? And so again, it's worth noting that this forest cell is not cannot be invaded, or at least we're only looking at uninvaded forest cells. So this is merely changes in burn probability and conditional flame length because of that fire spread we saw on the previous slide. And what we found was that indeed there are differences between the invaded and the uninvaded forest or the annual burn probability and conditional flame length for that forest cell when the proportion of the landscape, when the invaded proportional landscape increases. And then thinking about that same landscape, if you were to take away the invasion, we see different patterns here. So essentially the difference in annual burn probability increase as the proportional landscape becomes more invaded. So here, if we're considering about 50% of this landscape being invaded and 50% being uninvaded, we would see a 0.28% increase in annual burn probability for this forested cell. And that cell would be 9% more likely, if it were to burn at greater than 1.2 meters flame length. And this just only increases, these difference increases as that proportion of the surrounding landscape increases. So it's just a brief overview of some of the work we've done at landscape scale fire. John's going to talk a little bit more about this in the future, but a few key findings from this were that the Ventinata invasion may shift fuels in 2.5% of the ecoregion right now, even though it's invading a larger percent of the ecoregion. This is probably a conservative estimate for where Ventinata is increasing fuels. Invasion increased burn probability and conditional flame length in primarily these historically low productivity scablands. And forests and landscapes can both experience altered burn probability and fire behavior when their neighborhood is invaded because of that increased fire spread between the forest and invaded patches. So some implications for this are that greater fire spread between patches may lead to more frequent low or moderate severity fires in forests. What I didn't show is that we also looked at increases in flame lengths, conditional flame lengths greater than 8 feet, and we also saw an increase there, not quite as large as the increase in 1.2 meters or 4 feet. So while we're seeing increased fire in forests, some of this might be low severity fire, but a little bit of that increase in fire in forests is going to be high severity fire too. Could result in some canopy loss. So we might need to rethink fuel treatment locations and management strategies near scablands, especially if we were kind of using these to buffer our effects of our fuel treatments by placing fuel treatments next to scablands. If those scablands are now carrying fire, they might not have, those fuel treatments might not have the same effect they had before the scablands were invaded. The increased forest fire frequency may promote desired forest structure, again, because a common goal of forest management is to increase fire frequency in forests, especially at low severity, which may be what we see because of increased nearby invasion. However, post-fire invasion could reduce understory species, as we saw in the previous presentation, and that could impede forest recovery. So we don't really know how Ventinata competes with recovering seedlings, tree seedlings, but there could be an impact there post-fire that Ventinata may outcompete those seedlings. So you may actually see reduced understory diversity and maybe even reduced forest recovery, even if these aren't super high severity fires in the forest. Handline may be less effective in invaded patches, like we saw because of that increase in flame lengths, and that may require machinery to be brought in to manage fires in scabland patches, which machinery is known to exacerbate invasion in some cases, and moving seeds. It also requires that, we have limited personnel and resources. So for bringing machinery to areas that previously were able to manage with hand lines, this could be, we have to make some strategic decisions about where we're using those resources. And finally, impacts may increase in the future with invasion expansion. And John's going to talk a little bit more about that. So I'll pass it off to John Kim to tell us a bit more about how invasion and climate may influence future fire for the Western US. And just a reminder, we'll take your questions at the end, but feel free to post your questions as they come up. Thank you.
Okay, that's a great transition slide there, Claire. Can everyone see my my screen?
Yep, looks good, John.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so just transitioning right on here. Here's another slide that kind of tries to describe the large fire simulator. It's kind of impossible to do a fair job of describing this rather complex model with 1 or 2 slides, but this just kind of points out the fact that the model represents the the landscape as a grid, and you've got a whole suite of input grids that go into it. And then the other part of it is that the model simulates fire on a daily basis for the year, and then every year is repeated, or not every, that the year simulated represented by the weather data is repeated 10,000 times to stochastically to obtain the probability output at the end. So our work for simulating future conditions, it's a little bit of a work in progress at this point. It has very kind of a complex layout of what we have to do. We're integrating the FSIM fire model with species distribution model of Ventinata, and then we're combining that also with the output from MC2 dynamic general vegetation model. It has multiple stages that we're tackling, which includes running present day simulations, some of which Claire has described, working on obtaining mid-century climate projections, which we are mostly done with, and then creating the mid-century landscape conditions, and then running the simulations with that. FSIM is driven in terms of the weather variable that drives it. It's driven primarily with ERC, the energy release component, and previous studies have shown a very strong and clear correlation, at least at the continental to regional scales, between ERC and the number of fires, and ERC and the area burned. So that's on those are the two graphs on the left side. And then we've done some work in Southern California with FSIM, and in that work led by Alex Dye, we have also observed that projected increases in burn probability obtained through FSIM is also very strongly related to changes in ERC. So that's a good sign that ERC is a good driver for fire simulations. So we've created future mid-century and end-century ERC projections for the Blue Mountains, and we did that based on a gridded data set, and then we just picked the pixel that coincides with the Allison RAW station that we used for the present day simulations. And what you're seeing here is kind of a matrix of all of those future projections, and the x-axis is the months of the year, and the y-axis is the average days per month when ERC exceeds 80 percentile. And 80 percentile is an important threshold for FSIM simulations, because that's when FSIM ignites and spreads fire. And the thing that I kind of want to point out here is that there's actually a pretty big diversity of future projections of ERC depending on the GCMs. So what we're seeing here are 28 different GCMs. The dotted line is the ERC based on the Allison RAWs observed data, and then the orange, or kind of the dark yellow, and the solid blue lines are the end century and mid-century projections. So for some of the GCMs, you see a big bump in the spring, and others you might not. And I'm going to just go over that real quick. The other thing to point out is that these GCMs have been evaluated for their skill, that is their ability to simulate recent past observed climate in the Pacific Northwest. And I just check marked with green check marks the ones with the best skill, and then put X's next to those with the poorest skill. So while those these check marks and X's are not deal breakers per se of either including or excluding them from a study. It still serves as gives you some guidance as to how to weight the indications of that model. So I'm just going to quickly point out that that for some of the GCMs, they project a rather big bump in increase in ERC, the ERC values that exceed 80 percentile in early summers. So these are the ones that are in the green rectangles here. And then for some of the others, the ones highlighted in red rectangles, they seem to project a stronger increase in the mid to late summer. So, so for example, the one here right in the middle, GFDL ESM2G, for August, September, at least for end century, it's projecting probably, looks to me like about a 5 to 10 days increase in ERC, the number of days with ERC greater than 80 percentile. But also oddly for this GCM, for the mid-century, it's projecting a decrease for those months relative to Alice and Ross. So the individual GCMs are very kind of finicky and unique characteristics of projecting the future. Oh, and by the way, this is all under RCP 8.5 climate change scenario, which is a very high warming scenario. And then the black boxes here just point out the GCMs where very little change is indicated for the future. And then finally, there are a number of GCMs where even by mid-century, there is a significant decrease in the number of days with ERC greater than 80 percentile. Still just looking at the ERC values or the ERC projections. When we look at how ERC is calculated, a key driver of what increases the ERC in the future or decreases it is the projected change in precipitation. So in this plot, we've plotted how different GCMs project changes in precipitation for every month. And the pink box here highlights the fact that for a number of the GCMs, the summer precip is actually projected to increase. So that may have, at least in terms of simulated fire, as we simulated with FSIM, it may actually, it has the potential to drive fire activity downward for those GCMs. The other part of our big stage of our work is to create mid-century landscapes, what we call fuelscapes, to put into FSIM to drive the fire simulations. And the overall approach is to take a map of present-day conditions where invasion is highly likely, such as the scabline map, and then we overlay that with the Ventinata future projection, species distribution model projections of where they may, where the climate suitability may become more habitable for them. And then we sort of combine those to create future invaded fuelscapes. And then we modify that further using MC2 vegetation model projections to come up with alternate scenarios where the rest of the vegetation conditions may change. We've run a simulation so far with mid-century climate change conditions only for a GCM called HADGEM2 CC. And On the left side, we've got the output from FSIM for the historical burn probabilities. In the middle panel is the simulated mid-century burn probability. And then on the right is the difference between the two panels, because it's a little bit hard to eyeball and figure out where the differences are. And the interesting thing about this outcome here is that the burn probability changes, even though this GCM projects in terms of ERC, a fairly uniform warming across all of the summer months. The burn probability change actually doesn't happen evenly across the whole landscape. There are many places where it increases, and then there are many places where it actually decreases. So the question then, the interesting thing for us to do is to explore what is driving those spatial patterns of differences. So one thing we've looked at is does it vary by elevation, by different vegetation type zones? And while it does appear that some of the mid-elevation mesic forest types seem to, on average, have a greater increase, this doesn't quite explain all the spatial variability across all the elevation bands. So some of the other factors that we need to look at are how the changes in the up and down changes in probability may relate to ignition probability grids that we use, how the fire spread dynamic may change between present and future, how that may relate to the distribution of fuel types. And then maybe some of that just has to do with stochastic nature of FSIM, and it may create a more robust or more stable output with more than 10,000 simulations. So we have some preliminary thoughts about what may happen in the future under climate change, under a high warming climate change scenario. We think that climate change is likely to increase fire activity on average across the region, but increases in precipitation, especially those with more wetting days, could suppress ERC and therefore suppress simulated fire activity across the region. Let's see, taken as an ensemble, it seems like there will be likelihood of an increase in June, July, and August, but depending on which GCMs are better predictors of the future, it may be in the early summer, it may be in the latter half of the summer. So we've got some more simulation work to do. Our plan is to do several more GCMs, and then also compare FSIM outputs with and without fuelscape changes to see what role those play. But I think one big take-home message here is that there is a lot of uncertainty across the GCMs and across the landscape as well. So that's it for me.
Thank you, John. Really great talk, and I'd like to take this opportunity and thank all the speakers, Claire, Tai, and John, for their great talks. I think that we're gonna, why don't we take a few questions, Autumn, of specific to John's talk, or Claire's talk, right? Because we haven't done questions for John and Claire, so.
Okay. It looks like we have just two that came in that have been answered in text, which is great. So Chris Wilson asks, he wants to know about burn probability by slope. I don't know if there's more than that, but that's what he that's what he wrote in there. So
Well, if I could, maybe I'll take a whack at that. Maybe Claire could say something as well. Just based on my general experience with FSIM, we are finding that in some of the simulations with some GCMs, what happens is that the ignition probability increases everywhere. And in that case, landscape features don't seem to matter quite as much. But then there are other GCMs that result in simulations where there is a much greater fine scale difference in the burn probability. So in that case, I think what's happening is that the fire spread dynamic is playing a much bigger role in the simulated outcome. So I think in those cases, probably the landscape characteristics such as slope, elevation, the locality of, how local certain fuel types are and so forth, that'll play a bigger role. So it's a long way of saying I think slope probably is important in some of the climate change scenarios.
okay. And we have one more. It's fairly long, so I'll read it sort of slowly. And this is from Jim David, and he says that his question is one of logic. The annuals came in with very widespread grazing by cattle, sheep, and feral horses. As grazing increased and non-palatable native vegetation increased in size and cover, then the competition for water and light helped decrease annual densities, but the seed sources persisted in smaller patches as grazing pressure decreased. The question is, so are we looking at an invasion or a resurgence from the historical peak of grazing impacts brought about by fire control and now currently more large fires?
Yeah, thanks for the question, JD. I think it's a difficult question to answer, as you know, but I think as far as the implications of the invasion as it is right now, I think that it might, we're seeing Ventinata at a much higher abundance than anyone's reported historically. So whether it was present in the past, I think is up for debate. It seems like some people think it's been around much longer than other folks, but I think that the level of invasion now is not something we've seen before. And whether that was because of grazing or because of more suppressed fire, I think we just don't know. But I think that I'm not sure that the rate of spread right now is because of more large fires either. I think that was a common assumption, but a lot of our research is showing that it's not necessarily heavily impacted, heavily exacerbated by fire, that it invades regardless of fire. Obviously, these areas aren't, even when unburned, they still have some sort of historical impacts, whether that's from grazing or from a loss of surface soil and erosion. But yeah, I think that I'd be surprised if fire control alone in the current increase of fires was the reason for this present invasion. Seems like there's something more than that going on, more with increased propagule pressure and time since introduction. But yeah, this would be a great topic to continue discussing in the panel if you're sticking around. Thanks.
Okay, great. And we have answered all the questions that have been asked so far. So I think we're good to move on to the next part. Becky, do you want to take it over?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to share my screen just for a sec. And hopefully I can do this right this time. I think I figured out it's this has to do with my two displays. And so can folks, okay, so you should be able to see my screen with that slide with the different circles on it.
Looks good, Becky.
We got it.
Great. Okay, so yeah, so we're moving on to kind of a panel discussion, and I want to leave a lot of time to have that discussion. And so I I have some summary slides here, and I'm just going to kind of touch upon them because I think everything was covered in the talks, and that'll give us a little bit more time to maybe explore some of the questions and larger themes. So our work has really shown that Ventinata is expanding the overall invasive grass footprint in the ecoregion and will likely continue to expand into available vacant suitable habitat. Right now, about 8% of the ecoregion is invaded, primarily at about 4,300 feet and above in elevation in ecotones between forested and non-forested areas, openings, and in grasslands. We also found mean patch sizes increasing. Again, not all suitable areas have been invaded, so there are places that are still at risk for invasion. Ventinata does have a unique habitat, unique niche, and it invades places that other invasive annuals are not colonizing. And you can read Claire's paper, Tortorelli et al. 2020, to learn more about that. As we were just talking about, Claire was just mentioning, disturbance is not really necessary for invasion, but it can exacerbate populations and impact to native plant communities. So we found this across a variety of habitats. Of course, we did find that some places were more likely to experience increased invasion after wildfire. And again, that exacerbation of speed on native plant communities. This influence of fire appears to be linked to changes and mortality of native species, such as shrubs and trees. We found that Ventinata invasion can create novel landscape conditions and alter fire behavior in forests, despite primarily invading non-forest areas. So we have the invasion into our low productivity scablands that increase fire size, burn probability, and various metrics, and increasing fire transmission throughout the ecoregion. But the largest differences in simulated fire behavior were observed within invaded patches and in nearby uninvaded areas, including open and closed canopy forests. So the invasion is having landscape scale effects on simulated fire as it enhanced fuel connectivity and fire spread between invaded and nearby fuel-rich forests. We showed that future climate alone may also drive increased fire activity in the ecoregion, even if the invasion doesn't expand. And so we are working on that invasion-specific climate change link, as we talked about, doing some modeling work with that. But even in the absence of the change in the invasion, we know that climate change is going to likely cause more ignitions and increase burn probabilities across the landscape. This could open up more invadable habitat and substantially increase burn probabilities and potentially create grass fire cycles that could be very challenging to manage in the future. So early detection and treatment of Ventinata in areas not currently invaded or burned may be more cost effective and lead to better outcomes than post-fire management. So again, here's some citations. I know this is kind of not necessarily going to write stuff down, but all of these citations, if they're in press, and I think everything's in press on this except for the one at the end, or that last paper isn't quite out yet, the Tortorelli et al. We have several more papers that are coming out that we will post on our website, and you can contact me and any of the speakers to talk more or to get papers and additional information. And so I'd like to just open it up now. And I think, Autumn, we were going to try to kind of have people be able to ask live questions, but there was a couple of broader themes or questions that we were going to kind of revisit. So I'll just hand it back to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, for this part, since it's just discussion after this, if anyone would like to speak up and ask a question, just raise your hand and I will click on the allow you to talk so that you can ask that question. And yeah, and then perhaps those will lead to some discussions as well. And basically just raise your hand and we'll make your audio available. In terms of questions that are open, there aren't any, but we did have some of those that got moved. Let me take a look through those. Are there any recommendations for carrying out a prescribed fire in a forest adjacent to Ventinata Ventinata invaded scablands?
Yeah, I think there were several questions around prescribed fire and other kinds of fuel treatments and Ventinata. And we did not specifically look at that question, although I think some of the implications from our work are relevant. In particular, having disturbance next to seed sources and reduction in that canopy, we think that that's potentially really important. Ventinata doesn't grow in closed canopy forests. So once you open up the canopy combined with the disturbance, you can have additional invasion. I think one of the things that our work can be helpful for is, of course, if you're in an area where you don't have Ventinata around and you're considering a prescribed fire, we will be coming out with some maps that show potential habitat that is currently uninvaded that could be invaded, and that could be helpful. There's also the issue of potentially pre-treating Ventinata populations before those activities take place. So those are things that kind of pop into my mind, and then I want to let other folks on the panel who might have some thoughts around this chime in.
Yeah, I think that, the research is really limited on prescribed fire and invasion. Like we said, I don't know of any studies that have looked at different timing of prescribed fire. I think we really just have the sites that LED installed before the Upper Beaver prescribed fires took place in September. Perhaps there's another study out there that's in progress that we don't know about. I'd be interested in hearing more if anyone knows anything. But that being said, I think that there are some strategies that could take place in that Upper Beaver fire. As far as I know from reading some of the burn plan, that those burn, the forest areas were really targeted for fire, and I think there was some strategic avoiding of some of the more invaded scablands, especially where invasion might lead to the loss of some of those keystone sagebrush species. If you know you have a lot of invasion in areas where you want to keep your shrub component, maybe trying just to keep the fire away from those areas might be the first step. If you don't have the materials or the budget or the possibility of even treating such a large landscape for invasion. But yeah, if anyone from the audience has more to add here, we're always interested in learning more about what's going on.
We have a guest, Jesse Brunson, if you want to speak up.
Hi, thank you. I just have a question as a practitioner and a manager, land manager. One thing that would be really useful for us is availability of some of the mapping products from all of your work as GIS shapefiles or geo-referenced PDFs or something that would be usable, just so we're not spending the limited resources we have mapping what's out there and then high potential for future invasion. So I'm wondering what is available or might be soon that would be useful. Thank you.
Yeah, so we are posting, and I think actually we have a PDF up on our website, but the actual spatial data it has just been published by the Forest Service archive, and we have some DOIs associated with that. And we will be getting those up on our website. If you want to contact me or Tai directly, we can get you that data and metadata. And I don't know if you want to add anything, Tai.
No, I think that covers it. But yeah, we've pretty much wrapped up that process, and so it'll be available very soon. But yeah, we can share that data if you'd like to contact us directly too.
Okay. We have a couple open questions here. So the first one from Emily Stevenson asks, any guesses on how Ventinata will affect west side of Cascades landscapes?
Yeah, we have seen Ventenata around the west side. There was this infestation around Corvallis that we kept our eye on for a while. And after some of the west side fires, there has been interest and concern. There is the climate habitat over here is suitable for Ventenata. I think the issue of what else is going to be competing with it could be a big factor as to how invasive it might end up. So it's definitely something I would be on the lookout for on the west side.
I think part of what we're seeing on the west side is areas where Ventinata is invading are areas that are already heavily invaded by lots of other annual grasses. We have tons of exotic annual grasses and native annual grasses, not as many, on the west side. So you might not be seeing that shift in fuels that's heavily driven by the Ventinata invasion, like we're seeing on the east side where it's invading primarily uninvaded habitat. So kind of the same thing going on in like the oak savanna or down in California, where you already have this heavy annual grass component and it's just kind of adding to it instead of creating a whole new, kind of invading this whole new niche. But again, those are mostly anecdotal observations, so we haven't really had any research. There could be things going on that we're completely unaware of.
Okay. Next question from Chris Wilson is anyone studying the effects of the difference in thatch density for fall fire? So like thick thatch benefits or not from fall fire, sparse density benefits more or less?
I don't know anyone who's really looking at thatch. I don't know if you have seen anything, Claire. Not exactly sure what the question is in terms of thatch benefits or not from fall fire.
Yeah, Chris, if you would like to elaborate specifically on that question, just go ahead and raise your hand and I can allow you to speak up. Or I can find you.
Seen, even in unburned areas, I haven't seen a strong influence of litter on Ventinata invasion, especially in the scablands. It doesn't seem to create a very dense thatch. It may be because that thatch is just blowing away in the winter. In the forest area, it is just like cheatgrass and Medusa head, especially in burn forest, you're getting an extremely dense thatch created from Ventinata, but we're just not seeing that same kind of thatch in the scablands, at least in areas that I've been in the field. And some of my research has showed that looking at ground cover, we're not seeing a very heavy association with Ventinata and litter. It doesn't really seem to need that litter component to establish, which has been suggested for things like cheatgrass that might require some litter to get going. So I would imagine that it's not as heavy of a driver for Ventinata. But again, it'd be worthy of another study for sure.
I would definitely agree with that, Claire. And I think I would just add that one of the papers published about Ventinata back in 2015 by Wallace, he kind of thought that maybe that, thatch was contributing to higher soil moisture, which helped Ventinata in some sense, or, helped improve the suitability of certain areas, having soil moisture at a certain time of year to improve its ability to germinate. But I think that really hasn't been teased apart. And I think that, yeah, like you said, that somebody should definitely look closer at that specific question and whether or not, yeah, there's a big effect when you look at a landscape, because that was like a very controlled setting where I believe that they added thatch to whatever their pots were in the greenhouse or something like that. I can't remember the specifics, but
in a study that we didn't show results from in this presentation, but something that's in review right now, we actually seeded Ventinata into areas where it was already invading, but so I had a controlled amount of Ventinata seed that went into small subplots where we actually removed all the thatch and the above ground biomass prior to seeding in some plots, and in other plots we seeded it in just with the community and the litter that was present, and we saw absolutely zero effect of above ground biomass removal and that thatch removal on Ventinata success. And that was in 3 different vegetation types with 3 different perceived moisture contents. So this is kind of getting at Allie's question. I'm looking at soil moisture thresholds related to contraction, persistent expansion, and successful competition with native and other annuals. So we expected that wetter sites might see more, that Ventinata might be more competitive with other species in wetter sites just because competition can be stronger when there are more resources available. But we didn't see that in our removal study. We saw the same effect of removal, which was essentially no effect of removing litter and above ground biomass on Ventinata. Again, that was only over a 1-year period, so it could be that litter buildup or the removal of litter, same with above ground biomass, might take longer than a year to show those effects. But in the similar study where we looked at just the natural presence of biomass, so assuming that's pretty strongly correlated with litter, we did see an effect of soil moisture. So the wettest sites we saw that Ventinata decreased with increasing biomass that was present and increasing litter, but that was only present in those wet sites, and that relationship went away in the drier scabland sites than it's in the kind of ephemeral wet meadow sites. So there could be something going on with soil moisture there, or with just site productivity overall, where we're seeing greater competition with sites with greater soil moisture and greater productivity, especially probably with the below ground interactions, since those are interactions that we didn't influence with that above ground biomass removal.
Okay, great. I just wanted to read the question A. Emily Stevenson noted, I think this is going back to the prior question, and just wanted to acknowledge it before we clear it as answered, that they are seeing the Ventinata mainly in disturbed areas and gravel pits on the Gifford Pinchot and in old pasture lands so far. So just some further feedback on that prior question on the west side.
In the native range, in the native range, there is Ventinata is classically associated with gravel and in particular basalt gravel.
Okay. Jim Davis.
Sorry, I would say here, just a quick add on to that. I would say here in Corvallis, again, anecdotal observations, but it's seems pretty clearly associated with gravel roads and the movement of gravel to re-gravel roads, and the same on the east side. It's like the gravel's being moved around. Seems like an initial point of introduction for a lot of areas. I don't think there's been a study on that, but that's something that I've seen a lot of. It seems like wherever you have a gravel pile, you get Ventinata growing in that gravel, and then movement of that gravel transporting those seeds.
Great. If anyone has any further input they want on that, just go ahead and raise your hand or type it in there. And Jim Davis, looks like you have your hand raised.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I'd just like to comment on the horizon or the thatch from the Ventinata in areas on the Otico and the southern portions of it down along private ground on the Paulina district. I've seen rigid sage scablands that have a 1/2 inch O horizon on them. They appear to be a little more, have a little more moisture from the effects of the thatch, and have the sandberg bluegrass, and some of that has appeared to benefit from that, but they're largely rigid sage and with the Ventinata understory. But that was on a good grass year. We've looked at that site during some of these drought years, the last few years, and there was hardly any Ventinata that was over a couple inches tall, and you didn't see, you saw some residual thatch, but you didn't see any new thatch, obviously.
Interesting. Yeah, thanks, JD.
And these areas were You look at the old photos, some of our earliest photos. This is on the salt scab. They were light colored, even back in the 40s or 50s, where they took some of the original photos, aerial photos in black and white. Those areas they were still light colored then. So that just adds to my argument that a lot of the Ventinata was here for a long, long time, possibly into the 1800s. I think it came in with the bromes, the 5 brome species we have on the Ochoco. I think it came in with them and have ebbed and flowed with the grazing and the fire ever since. Fire control, I think, has masked a lot of that presence from a floristic standpoint.
Yeah, interesting.
Okay. Another question is Jesse Brunson asks, going back to Claire's first presentation, Ventinata seems to be outcompeting native annual herbs and non-sprouting shrubs post-fire. To me, this implies one way to restore these areas might be supplemental seeding of native species. What are your thoughts on this?
I think that could be a great option. I don't think anyone's done any research on this, and because it seems like disturbance to the scablands is, or like this level of scabland disturbance is relatively recent. I don't think there have been a lot of efforts to restore these areas in the past. So it could be that a seeding native species would be a great way to restore these areas. I don't know what kind of effort that would take. I don't know what kind of seed what kind of seed we already have collected from these areas, or how much of an effort that would be to gather that seed. But it sure seems like it couldn't hurt.
Okay. Looks like we have one more question in the open questions from James Dickinson. And it's a long one. And James, I've also allowed you to speak if you want to clarify this at all after I'm done reading it, but I'll give it a go first. So, have you measured the light needs for Ventinata? Assessing both the canopy cover and crown closure provide a management opportunity to prevent spread or isolate populations. Those factors also would be closely related to snow retention and hence soil moisture availability. It would also be interesting to look at light core readings in artificially shaded plots of scablands to better isolate the light needs from potential moisture timing needs. And so the first question is, have you measured the light needs for Ventinata?
We have not measured the light needs, although I think we had a canopy closure metric at the landscape scale that seemed to be relevant, which I believe came from Ty's work around 40% canopy closure. Is that correct, Ty?
Yeah, I don't think we saw Ventinata 40% or above. Yeah, that's definitely a pretty strong threshold, at least yeah, in the forested areas.
Yeah, I'd say about 45% was the cutoff for the plots that I sampled on the ground, and even in some plots of 40% cover, we still saw over 50%. 40% canopy cover, we still saw about 50 or over 50% Ventinata cover in some cases, rare cases. But I think about after 45% cover, so that I didn't find really any. So it's like there's a pretty strong cutoff there.
Yeah, I think that we have pretty good information from the combination of our work to define Ventinata's habitat in the ecoregion, particularly its invasive habitat. And so that's, I think, an important, management tool in order to be able to identify those areas that are at risk, that are currently uninvaded. Those places, I think, can potentially be the most cost-effective for folks. The restoration after invasion, particularly after fire, when you kind of have that exacerbation in invasion, it's just extreme. You're talking about extremely difficult. You need control, reseeding, a full restoration approach, and that becomes just so cost prohibitive. There was one thing I wanted to add when we were talking about prescribed fire. Luke Ritter's work up on the Zumwalt, was in a grassland, so it didn't have that canopy interaction with fire. And so his work showed really that invasion was independent of whether you were conducting prescribed burning or not. But we really think that those results have to be put in the context of where you're burning, and when you don't have a lot of shrubs and trees that are necessarily dying, you're going to have a different relationship in a grassland than say you would in a shrubland, woodland, or a forest when you do burning and remove canopy. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about fire. There's those impacts to the broader community that could be driving invasion, not just the actual fire itself. And I know we've gone over a little bit. I know we started a little late, but we probably should wrap up. But I'm so glad everyone is engaged, and we've had this great conversation.
Yeah, and we've answered all the questions. So thanks everybody for typing those in, and our multi-pronged approach to getting those all answered. Just one more plug. If you guys, when you sign off, you'll be taken to a short poll. If you could just take that, it's like 3 questions about how useful the webinar was. If you could take that, it really just helps us with our programming and having relevant webinars going forward. And that's all for me.
Thank you, Autumn, for facilitating, and thank you everyone again, all the great speakers.
Thanks, everyone.
Great, thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.